So, everyone, welcome. I am Becca B, and this is Becca's Book Talks. I have with me a very special guest whose wonderful novel that I read, I think, about maybe over 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And this is Jared Reck. And, sir, how are you today?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for having me on here. This is awesome. How are you
So,
today?
doing well, doing well. I'm grateful that you wrote back concerning about my family. So it's this week that we're gonna
Yeah,
be, yeah. Anyway, so did you get a chance to look over the questionnaire that I sent you?
yeah, yeah. I did.
Awesome. All right. So for Becca's Book Talks, what I do is that I send everyone um, a questionnaire as well as a recommended book list. And so I have the questionnaire right here, and we are ready to go. Okay. So if you could, what are the top 10 books that have influenced your life and in your profession, whether it be personal narratives or stories that have left a lasting impression on you, and why?
Yeah, I love this question to start. My list might go over 10 here. I've kind of got them
That's
like
fine. That's fine. The more books, the better.
category, like chronological here. I was thinking back to like earliest childhood stick out in my mind. One is there's a monster at the end of this book, or the monster at the end of this book, the Grover book, because my dad had a killer Grover voice. My dad did the voices. He was an elementary teacher, and that was just one of the things he was really good at. So I remember just having him read that to me as a little kid and just loving it. And even, spoiler alert, Grover's the monster at the end of the book. And even knowing that as a kid didn't matter, just loved it every single time. So that one. And then there's a Dr. Seuss.
Sorry, was it Grover or Grouch?
That one's Grover.
Grover.
That one's definitely Grover.
Okay.
Yep.
All
Yep.
right.
And then there's a Dr. Seuss book called Oh Say Can You Say. It is, in my mind, the most perfect book of tongue twisters ever written. That's another one. I remember, if you remember, like the Blue Dot section in the elementary school library, that was like the early reader section. They had a little blue dot sticker on the spine. And I just remember going into that section long after I was supposed to be browsing the blue dots, just so I could take Oh Say Can You Say home again, just to
Nice.
get my dad to read. Try and do the whole thing, but there was like one tongue twister in particular, Pete's Pat's Pigs, that got him every single time. And I just remember like his belly laugh after like screwing it up and just laughing together. So there were the two biggest ones. That one actually, when I had my own daughters, Maddie's my oldest daughter, she's 25 now. But when she was just a little kid, reading that one to her and just getting so good at it where I could just like go through it without tripping up even once. And then her younger sister Mabel is like 8 years younger, and then Maddie did the same thing. Every time my wife and I would go out, and like Maddie would be in charge of babysitting Mabel, that's what they would do every one of those nights. They would make sure that at bedtime Maddie would read Oh Say Can You Say to Mabel, and Maddie could do it without tripping up even once. And now my oldest daughter Maddie has a daughter of her own, little Olive, so I'm a grandpa now too. And I get to just like see that like one more generation down of Oh Say Can You Say. So this thing's traveling now through 4 different generations. So those are the first 2 big ones going back to like early childhood. Next 2 would just be Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes. I never considered myself like a big reader as a kid, but I think I was a much bigger reader than I realized. I always had at least those next to my bed every single night, first with Garfield through elementary school, just reading the ones I had just on a loop. And then throughout middle school, starting Calvin and Hobbes and just all through the treasuries. So they had a huge impact just on my sense of humor, my love of like cartoons and comics and kids' books.
So were those considered, I'm sorry, so were those considered comics that you had?
I guess so. I guess you would call them. I mean, they were technically comics from like the newspaper comics,
Yeah.
like the whole, the
But they
Treasury.
were but they were compiled into like a book form, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, and because I think Jim Davis is still making Garfield books. They're still coming out. I forget what number he's up to now, but they're amazing. My daughters both loved them. Same with Calvin and Hobbes. So those were 2 big ones. Getting into high school, there's a writer named Dave Barry who is a humor writer. He was a columnist for the Miami Herald. This is be back in like the 90s into the early 2000s. And a couple of my like best friends in high school had this book of his, and I'd never heard of him. and they gave it to me one day. We were just at their house, just like cackling at these lines in Dave Barry's columns, like just goofy, self-deprecating stuff. The line about, I just remember this line about a testosterone torpedo, and just like us as high school guys, like, this is the funniest thing ever. So just reading a couple of Dave Barry books that I had then, like Dave Barry's Guide to Guys and Dave Barry in Cyberspace, which is really funny now because this would have been like the 90s. So it's talking about like Windows 95 and stuff like that in the book. But just at the time, that had probably the biggest impact on my writing style, like all throughout college. Like, I was just trying to imitate Dave Barry's sense of humor. So those were really big ones. Into college, I remember the first books that just kind of rocked me, that just hit so hard, so deep in my gut, like literature, because I didn't particularly enjoy it in high school. I, probably fake read a lot of the stuff I was assigned to read in high school, minus like a couple of them that I liked.
Yeah.
But in college, I went to Clemson, and I forget which year it was, my second or third year there. They were bringing an author in that, like, I think every English course in the college was going to read Gloria Naylor's, one of her novels called Mama Day. I'd never heard of it, knew nothing about it. Again, didn't consider even though I was like switching to English as a major, still didn't consider myself like a huge reader. But I read this thing, and it's one that, like, I finished it probably in 2 nights because it was due like in 2 days. But it was one I finished. It's like, oh my God, like, what did I just read? This thing hit me so hard, and I just loved it. And then I got like one of her other books when she showed up to do like this big event and book talk at like the big auditorium at Clemson. So it was another one of hers called Bailey's Cafe. And those two books, I think, are two of the biggest ones that stand out in my life, especially of like in the world of like adult heavy literature. Just stood out above pretty much everything else I read throughout college and early adulthood. When I went back to get my teaching certification, so I've been a teacher now for 20 years. I spent 17 years as an 8th grade language arts teacher, and now I'm in my 3rd year teaching high school English. But back at the very beginning was when I first really discovered young adult. Like, didn't even know it was a thing when I was in high school. But when I had to take coursework to get my teaching certification, there was an adolescent lit course. And that was the first time I read Laurie Holtz Anderson with Speak, because that came out in '99. And so I would have read this a couple years after, probably within 5 years after that. And Chris Crutcher's Athletic Shorts. And Speak blew me away because I didn't know that like there were books like that about high schoolers. And I wasn't that far past it. So I was really just like still felt deeply connected to this. But even more so with Chris Crutcher. He is like, I have like 2 people I consider my writing heroes at just like the very top of my list. And it's Chris Crutcher and A.S. King. But reading Crutcher for the first time in my early 20s, again, just was so blown away that he was dealing with, one, that he was doing sports really well, because I was an athlete in high school and it was hard to find books. Didn't feel like there even were books that like hit that really well, like a high school athlete in a very realistic way. And I read Crutcher, I was like, wow, he's got it. But beyond that, Crutcher was also he's like a longtime therapist, especially of adolescence. And a lot of that was pulled into his novels as well. And again, I was just blown away that an author was even tackling these things, that was like hitting what it was like to be a teenager, a teenage athlete, just dealing with very real high school issues in such an honest way. So Athletic Shorts was the first one I read by him. That's like his big one of short stories. But after that, I've read all of his books multiple times through. Like, they are just ones that are still really important to me as a writer.
I know that when I taught for almost 6 years, and I had a collaborator. She actually taught, we kind of split up the grades. I taught 11 and 12. She taught 9 and 10. And I remember that Speak was one of the core books that she had. But I'm not sure not to go off tangent or anything, but we were certified in ERWC. Have you heard of that?
Only in your email. That's the first I'd come across that. But yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not even sure if you can even get college credit for those classes now, because I think some things have changed. But
Mhm.
basically, it's like expository reading and writing curriculum, and there are some books that are listed that were made into these modules or lessons based on the
Yeah.
text. And I know I believe Speak is one of them, and the ones that I had were by John Krakauer, and I think there may be like 3 or 4 more. What grade do you actually teach for high school? Or is it
Now,
mixed?
I have juniors, and then I teach creative writing, which is 9 through 12. But my junior classes, we have it split up into like 3 different tracks. There's like the honors AP track, and then just the academic in the middle, and then just like the general English. I typically, in my 3 years up there, I have gotten like all the general English 11, and then a few of like the middle level academic English 11.
When
Yeah.
it comes, we'll get back to the books in a moment, but when it comes to creative writing versus teaching 11th grade English, which one do you cater to the most?
Honestly, I really love like the English classes. I mean, I love doing the creative writing, and I'm like just so honored that I get to do that at the high school level, but I still have so much fun doing the English, just like the actual, especially like that middle academic level English class, because I've just done, my class has been run as like a reading writing workshop since
Mm.
like my first year in the classroom, in a middle school classroom like 20 years ago. And I still have so much fun doing it that way with high schoolers, where the goal is just, read more than they've ever read in their lives, write more than they've ever written in their lives, and hopefully have a lot more choice than they've ever had before. So just with creative writing, I don't have that same opportunity to just try and get kids into reading, and that's always been like my like number one passion and goal as a teacher, is just getting kids to find that like one book that shakes them and gets them to realize like there are a lot of really good books out there that will speak to them, and just get
Yeah.
them hooked on reading. So I still probably like the English classes a little bit more than doing creative writing, even though I love doing creative writing courses.
Yeah. Were there any more books on the list that you can think of that influenced you up to this
Actually,
point?
just transitioning into teaching, I really love reading professional books. And I think teachers need to be reading professional books. You need to know like what the masters in our content areas are doing. So the biggest ones for me early on when I very first started was Nancy Atwell. She was like the guru of reading and writing workshop back in like the 80s. So I had her first huge book, In the Middle. She had another book, Lessons That Change Writers, that was hugely influential on my teaching and my own writing. And then her book called The Reading Zone, which is just all about, again, that idea of getting kids hooked on reading and how you set that up in your classroom and what like the core tenets of that are. Then outside of Nancy Atwell, the biggest ones otherwise are Kelly Gallagher, who wrote Read Aside, which is another huge one, hugely impactful about how we kill reading at the secondary level. And then he's collaborated with Penny Kittle for a few huge books in the past few years. The real big one was called 180 Days, where it's the two of them actually just planned together on 2 different sides of the country of 180 days, like a full school year. Here's what
Right.
it looked like. So that has been really helpful, especially again, like since I moved to the high school level, seeing that like, yeah, reading writing workshop absolutely works at like the high school level. It's not something that's just like, oh, this is very middle school and they grow out of it.
Right.
Absolutely. Like you can do that all the way up through AP. I teach grad courses at McDaniel College, close to where I live here in Pennsylvania.
That's what I was
Uh,
going to ask you about if you did college like part-time or full-time. How does that work with your
uh,
with your schedule?
so I'm an adjunct. It's a program that I actually took when I was writing my first book, probably like 10 years ago now. I took a few of the courses. As a full-time teacher, even though I'd always kind of wanted to like go get like an MFA in creative writing, even like the low residency programs is just not feasible for like as a full-time teacher and a dad, like, and a husband. Like I
Yeah.
can't just take like, oh, I'm going to take 10 days off in January to go to Boston or Ireland for the workshop. Like it just, that's not going to happen. But McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland, at the time I found they had just like this fully online, it wasn't an MFA, it was like a 15 credit graduate certificate in writing for children and young adults. I could get tuition reimbursement from my school, like as a teacher, to take a couple of these courses. So that's kind of how I got into it. Then I got my first book. First book came out back in 2017, and within like a year or so after that, had reconnected with the program director at McDaniel and was able to start just doing adjunct. So it's all online. So I teach two of the 5 courses now at McDaniel. The intro course, which is reading like a writer, and then the last course is just like an actual workshop course over the summer. So if you've like kind of gone through at least some of the courses, because there's also like a novel writing course and a picture book writing course that I recently took and absolutely loved it. There's a nonfiction writing course, and then you end it with the workshop course, taking one of those projects a little bit further.
Yeah, I've actually taken, it took me a little over a year to complete, but there's this I'm not sure if you heard of Stephen and Danny Alcorn of the Writing Academy.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of them?
I have not.
So yeah, they have like a whole separate online course for just about every subject: nonfiction, fiction, screenwriting. And
Mm-hmm.
then, but what I thought is that at the end of each program, you had to have at least a completed manuscript. That's
Yeah.
not so much the case. You can if you want to. And then there's a separate, they do have another course where you can actually get feedback for the manuscript before it's published.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I wish I had them before I self-published my own. I think
Yeah.
I could have gotten it for a heck of a lot less.
Yeah.
Um, but it's, again, writing is a learning experience. When is taking writing courses overwhelming? When do you feel like, okay, I've taken all the writing courses I can. If I decide to take one more, is it like overstimulating? Do you ever feel that you've met the standard to be happy with where you are right now?
I think that's probably one of the challenges of being like a creative person, is that you never feel like I don't know, I have a pretty ugly critic voice in my head that can be pretty nasty most of the time. So I don't know, I feel like probably most of us who write or do any kind of artwork have a similar jerk in our head.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I will ever feel that like I have hit that standard. Um, More, I just hope I am like maintaining the level that got me originally published, that I can just continue to be lucky enough to books out in the world. um, that's kind of my hope. As far as taking writing courses, that's something I never considered for a long time, because when I first started teaching, I had no plans to ever write a book. Didn't even think that it was possible to write that many words, that many pages. When I first started, I just wanted to be a good teacher. And for me, that meant um, teaching the way that my 8th grade teacher, a guy named Keith Smith, I wanted to have his classroom. He ran like a writing workshop when I was an educator back in like the early 90s. And so when I went back to start teaching, like that's what I wanted to do. I wanted his classroom. And I ended up actually literally getting his classroom. My first job teaching was a long-term sub for him. He was out on paternity leave with his youngest daughter. So my first year of teaching, I was literally just like stealing his lesson plans, and that's where I got like the Nancy Atwell books. I had like his dog-eared and highlighted copies. Um, and that's like kind of, I wouldn't be a writer if I hadn't first become a teacher. It just wouldn't have happened. It was years of doing writing workshop with my kids, like always write. If I'm asking them to write memoir, I always write memoir with them. If I ask them to write poetry or short fiction, I'm doing it too. And it was just those years of doing that with my students, like writing with them and in front of
Yeah.
them. That kind of led to it. So I didn't take any writing course, until much later, after I'd started like writing my first book,
Mhm.
and took it really, again, because my school was gonna give me like get tuition reimbursement for it, and by that point, like I was really excited to take that kind of course, so I was like locked into it. um yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at
Yeah.
all, but yeah.
Yeah. Few questions as a teacher who teaches a
Mhm.
writing and possibly and you also teach a reading course?
At the high school, oh, in the college level, in the
Yeah.
grad course program.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the intro to the program is a course called Reading Like a Writer.
Yeah.
So there's not a whole lot of creative writing in that first course. I try and weave a little bit in of like just activities that I do with my, like I used to do with my middle schoolers. I still do them with my high schoolers. I sprinkle a couple into the course, but that initial course is very much reading children's books and young adult novels as a writer, to just kind of switch your brain a little bit, to instead of just enjoying it as a reader, to really look closely at like, well, what are these writers doing? What is it that they're pulling off?
Yeah. Do you use what is it called? Close. I think it's called close reading. Is that what you teach them as they're reading these novels to
I
like
think we
question?
never really call it that, but I think that's essentially what we're doing. It's, yeah,
Okay.
just again,
Because it was interesting, not to go off tangent here, but there was what was it, last month? There was this, I don't know if she was a high school, I think she was a high school student. I don't remember the name, but she graduated and she ended up suing the school because she graduated without having a clue how to read properly. And my question is, how is that possible? And that begins, but I've seen other teachers' vlogs on YouTube that say they have seventh graders who are reading at a second grade or even third grade level, and
Mhm.
they're not familiar with any of the words here. So my question to you as a teacher of this type of curriculum, have you ever received student enrollments where students had no clue what was on the page, or they had so much trouble reading that everything becomes jumbled? What do
Mhm.
you think that these students are missing by the time they get to your class, if
Um,
anything?
it's hard. I think the biggest thing is just a volume of reading and any kind of like love of reading from a very early age. We are now, what, 25 plus years into testing culture.
Hmm.
Um, state tests really blew up, and 25 years in, I don't think we know anything more than what we already knew, quarter a century ago, that kids in poverty and kids with learning disabilities, which very often overlap, struggle more with reading and math and test taking in general. Like, I don't think we needed to waste 25 years to come to that conclusion. And I think that testing culture has played a huge part in just killing a love of reading, from a very early age. If you start state testing in third grade, and if you have kids of your own, anybody watching, like you have your own kids, you probably recognize that around third grade is when school takes a very drastic turn for a lot of our kids. That's when school kind of starts to suck for a lot of kids, because that's the year where like things really start to focus on test taking. And yeah, but yes, I have absolutely had students every year, especially now that I am teaching like the lowest level of high school juniors. I still have kids every year who are probably reading at upper elementary school levels. And again, if like they've spent years either fake reading or avoiding reading or really
Yeah.
becoming like antagonistic to reading, like,
Mhm.
you're not getting any better at reading without reading. There is no magic like skill. There's no standard that they've been missing over the years. Like, well, if they could just figure out how to identify main idea, I'm sure
Mhm.
they much better readers. Like, it doesn't actually work that way. It's just a volume of reading. You got to do the thing.
Right.
And makes it so hard is getting kids to really enjoy reading in any way. when it's been this thing that's been this awful, miserable chore for so long.
That's I think I think you just said it, that it becomes a chore rather than being something of passion and pleasure.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to what you said, the testing culture. So as going back to what you're doing for the creative writing course, do you create a curriculum around that and do you grade them? Or is it just having them build up a portfolio by the time they're done with the semester or year?
For me, again, it's always been a delicate balance, because if you do any of like the research on the effectiveness of SSR, of like sustained silent reading, which is kind of like the core of reading workshop, I'm always very leery of attaching like grades or too many other things to it outside of just the reading. So I've always kind of struggled with that. I don't have like a perfect answer for it. My practice now is just that good faith effort. If you are reading with me, I devote like 15 minutes to every single day in my classroom to just independent reading. And my job is to help you find books that you are going to love. So I got to know a whole lot of books, and I got to know my kids really well to be able to just hand them like a curated stack at any moment, that they might be able to pull one out that they finally connect with. But mostly, like, if they're willing to read with me every single day for 15 minutes, usually like a couple times in a marking period, I'll just drop in like a independent reading grade. And like, again, I go around and like check in on their page numbers every day. Not that they have to be reading at a certain pace, because I'm actually a super slow reader. It's more just, it gives me information. It's not, again, I've done this long enough. It's real easy to figure out like who's faking it, who's hiding a phone in their lap, and all those little things as a teacher that you're just like constantly battling with. It's pretty easy to figure that out, and it just gives me a way to just interact with them a little bit every single day. So it's really just like, you're reading with me every day, awesome. I want that to show up in your grade. There's probably a lot of other English classes throughout their live students where they never read a thing. Like, it's not that hard to fake read if you're assigned the same book or passage or a story out of a textbook. Like, that's real easy to fake it. And that feels like a waste of time to me. Like, I just need you doing the thing.
This thought just occurred to me. I want to do the questionnaire and then get to the book that I read of yours later. But one thing that just popped up. There's a character in your book called Mrs. Bixler.
Yeah.
And it's Oscar's favorite teacher because, I guess, I'm not sure, when it comes to characterization, do you believe that your character Oscar Olson that you created is dyslexic?
Yeah.
Okay. So because I think it says, I have to look at the quote, but it says when he would read words on a page, everything was just jumbled. And then his teacher says, you can actually do audiobooks. I will allow that. And he retained 42 books. So do you think that our teacher, I don't know of other teachers that have done this, but do you allow for students to listen to audiobooks if they're able to retain it? Is that something that you picked up?
Yes, very much. I've tried over the years, because again, I still have that like nagging teacher voice in my head. I know what some colleagues might think. That my ideal would be for those students who are much more auditory, that if I can get the book in their hands at the same time that they're listening, because I think I actually had the one, his like 7th grade teacher mentions that. That's like, for me, that's the ideal, is that a kid could be like listening and seeing it at the same time. And I know I've read a little bit of research on dyslexic students that because they have to build a sight vocabulary instead of being able to process like letters in a word, they're almost recognizing shapes of entire words, and it takes a whole lot of, again, volume to get to that. So especially if I had those back in middle school, even kids with like between like dyslexia and like hearing disabilities or hearing loss would try and do that, of like being able to see it and hear it like with an audiobook at the same time. But even at the high school level now, again, I feel bad about this. I don't like advertise it to all my students, because I still have that nagging teacher fear, teacher critic back in my head that like, oh, they're all just going to cheat. They're all just going to listen to it. But in my heart, I know, like, if I had just a handful of students that I know really struggle, but they are auditory and they can listen, and I can still like talk to them and get updates from them, like, yeah, that's, to me, that counts. I don't know personally, like, if it translates over to a standardized test, but a lot of times those are kids who sadly, like, have never even been close on standardized tests anyway. So to get them just to
Yeah.
process story in their brain is hugely valuable to me. It's still hitting all like the things that are most important about reading, with empathy and just story structure, and um, even just down to like syntax and vocabulary and all of those things that maybe it's just going to come out more verbally for those students down the road. But I still have to think that that is tremendously impactful, even if maybe it doesn't show up on a state test.
Yeah. Yeah. Testing, even like for me, I don't recall doing, I may have had it in middle school, but I remember the state testing that we had to do in high school. And I'm looking at it going, I feel like I'm wasting my time.
Yeah,
I don't, some of the questions on these state tests, we didn't even go over any of this. I'm like, how are we supposed to know this? And now when I'm looking at teachers, when it comes to advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses, which I've never heard of until
yeah,
recently,
yep,
and I'm looking at it going, well, unless if you've taken a course like this, you're not going to know what in the world they're talking about that is on this test. And
yep.
that to me is just a huge waste of time. Were there any other books that have influenced you up to this point besides, I know you mentioned
Um,
the professional teachers books. Were there any others?
those were the big ones. I got, yeah, between Nancy Atwell and then Kelly Gallagher, Penny Kittle. Those are the biggest ones, like in my professional teaching life, that have made the biggest impact. And then as far as like after that, again, I have a couple of just writing heroes for me. Some of like the biggest books. A.S. King is my other writing hero. She is just absolutely brilliant. She has also won, kind of like Crutcher has now won, I forget if it's the Margaret Edwards, it's like the Lifetime Achievement Award in children's and young adult lit that the ALA gives out every year. So she's now won that. But she has one of her books, Everybody Sees the Ants, is probably my number one all-time favorite book. If I had to just pick one, that's the one. But really, all of her books. When I'm writing, I wish I could sound like Chris Crutcher and A.S. King and John Green.
What did A.S. King write that you think is like the best?
All of hers are kind of just brilliant. Everybody Sees the Ants is that's my favorite of hers, of really any books. She wrote one right after that called Ask the Passengers. That's also right there on my list. But she's written, again, she's got a whole catalog of amazing books. She
Is that
just Prince Award for Dig, one of her newest ones, 2 years ago, maybe.
mhm.
Yeah, just you look her up if you haven't read her. She's brilliant.
So of those books that you mentioned, which book would you recommend for today's readers? And just out of curiosity, on top of that, which book would you definitely recommend for teachers who are interested in not only teaching English, but are interested in doing a writer's course for students?
Yeah. For the teacher side of it, I still think like the Nancy Atwell works are that's the gold standard in reading and writing workshop. And when I was taking courses at McDaniel as a graduate student, I was amazed at how closely aligned those courses were to what I was reading in Nancy Atwell in writing workshop. Like it's stuff that I had done with my middle school students for 10, 15 years. It was the same like writing activities. And it hit me like, oh, well, that's because when Nancy Atwell was developing that with a couple of other just huge writing teacher gurus back in like the late 70s and 80s,
Mhm.
the idea was that they were observing writers. Like they were trying to analyze, how do writers write? What are the things that writers actually do? And that's what like the whole thing was developed around. So all of it was just based on like the real thing. So I still think going back to Atwell is like the best possible thing. But if you've never read any of like Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle, like 180 Days, that one fits so well with just like today. Like you could implement that next school year in your high school classrooms, and I think it is just perfect. As far as from the list of just books from childhood on up, the only one that might not fit now is just Dave Barry, because it would be probably so dated, that he was like, writing humor columns back in like the 90s, and maybe those, because they were like nonfiction and just joking about things at the time, maybe that one doesn't hold up as well, even though I've still had like one or two high school guys that I've gotten to read some Dave Barry and they loved it. The rest of them are like, man, like the Grover book and Oh Say Can You Say, still awesome. Garfield, Calvin and Hobbes, I would still want my children and grandchildren to read those things because I still think they're funny and brilliant. All the way up through, I think all of them. I think that's why they still stand out on my list.
With your teacher schedule and everything else, what was the last story you read, and what are your thoughts and takeaways from that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I am almost done right now, because again, I read with my students every single day, so I'm usually like reading quite a bit. But I'm just finishing up. It's a nonfiction one called Accountable by Dashka Slater. She wrote The 57 Bus, which was on your list of banned books that you shared with me.
Really?
But this was her newest one. I got it because it was on this year's Pennsylvania's Reader's Choice Award. From like the Pennsylvania Library Association, but it's a nonfiction. It reads almost like a really brilliantly done podcast as it's piecing together. It was in California, in like the Bay Area, back in, I think 2017 is when it initially started. It was about this racist Instagram account that some students at Albany High School had started just amongst friends, and that got out to the rest of the population, the student population, and it just exploded and just turned this whole town upside down. And so the whole book is just piecing all of that together. And I love it because there's always so much nuance to it, that it's not just like good guys, bad guys. It is really just looking at the nuance and complexities of all of this in a really honest way. So that one's really good. That's won some major like nonfiction awards recently as well. So Accountable is the one I'm currently reading that I'm almost done with. Prior to that, I had just finished. It was an adult book. I've been trying to read a couple more adult titles because typically I just read young adult because that's what I love. That's what I write. That's what I do. I read one recently by Jeff Zentner. He is a YA author that I really love and admire. So this was his first adult novel that just came out this past year, called Colton Gentry's Third Act, that I just loved every bit of it. Even though it's about like a country singer who gets up on stage at the very beginning, and he's lost his friend recently, who was another musician in a mass shooting, and he gets up on stage at a country concert and just basically tells everyone like about gun culture, like F off, forget you and your guns. And that doesn't go over well in the country music fan like world. So his like whole career blown up. And it's him like going back home to Tennessee, and just his life exploded, and just trying to start over again. And I just love Zentner's writing anyway, and I wanted to see how he did it trying like an adult novel, and it was just so good. I just loved every single bit of that book. Yep.
Because I was just gonna say, because I became a country music fan when I got to just before I entered community college, and I've been a country fan ever since. But yeah, there is that I don't want to say cross section, but I think there's like an overlap between those who are all about country, and then there are those who are in country that are all about the gun culture versus those that are not.
Yeah.
Like Carrie Underwood. I'm not sure if you've heard her song, Little Toy Guns.
I have not. I don't listen to country at all, but I still just loved this book because I just enjoy Zentner so much.
But that hits the nail on the head with that song there.
Yeah.
So are you taking, besides being a teacher and an adjunct and all, are you taking part in any other reading challenge from a local library group or any other challenge at this time?
I am not currently. No, no. Again, I'm a really slow reader as it is, so I don't fly through books, and that's a lot of pressure to add another one to it. So no, I'm not part of any clubs or challenges at the moment.
Okay. So, but speaking of the band, here comes the question. What is the
Yeah.
biggest obstacle that our readers are facing today, especially right now, in the wake of the current banned books, including the one that you just mentioned, from this year or from last year? And what kind of impact does that have for students and teachers, the school libraries, and bookstore clientele? I know that there's a difference between those that are on the West Coast versus those that are on the East Coast.
Hmm.
So what have you seen as a teacher that is the biggest obstacle that's facing?
Um, I got two different thoughts on this because one, just my role as a teacher for so long of just trying to get kids to love reading and to find books that they love.
Mhm.
Book banning has never been any obstacle that I've had to deal with. Like my biggest obstacle is just getting kids into reading. In fact, a lot of times, like getting on a banned book list is good publicity, like for authors.
Yeah. Like I
Like
was just gonna say, it's like almost an achievement. So
absolutely, because you were just ticking off someone somewhere across the country. Because usually the banned book list doesn't necessarily mean like books have just been pulled off shelves. Although we've started to see quite a bit more of that in like the past year or so.
yeah.
Um, Typically before, it just the statistics that they put out every year are just like the number of challenges that a book has gotten at schools or public libraries across the country. And that's where you'd see like those numbers. So it usually just meant some very specific group with a very specific religious or conservative ideology has a
Mhm.
problem, typically with anything with LGBTQ community or
Yes.
anything that's dealt with race in a really honest way over the years. I mean, it's really obvious the ones that get picked out for challenges
Uh-huh.
over years. So that's actually never been an obstacle for me as a teacher. I've been lucky that I haven't had any kind of pushback from parents over the years or my particular school district of making me like take certain titles off my shelves. And part of it is like if you're doing reading workshop and students are choosing their own books the vast majority of the time, a
Mhm.
lot of the book bans historically have taken place when you assign certain books, when everybody must read this book. That's
Yeah.
where a lot of the challenges initially came in. Again, things have changed pretty drastically in the past couple of years here.
Mhm.
As groups have gotten emboldened and feel like they've got the right and the power just to go in and tell all of our kids what they're allowed to read. I think now that's probably just one of the challenges that I'm more cognizant of as a classroom teacher and as I kind of am like my school's um, pretend librarian right now, where I'm just kind of like we don't have like a librarian in my high school. So
Oh,
I
that's
as a
interesting.
teacher, like I've kind of complained about it and now have, you know, get to be the one that updates the high school catalog in like the actual library space. So I have to be careful of what I include there. And I've had tremendous support from my administrators and my school district.
Good.
The only times I might get myself um, not in trouble, but like that I have to be careful is when I'm pulling books off of like Book Talk. You know, if I'm pulling stuff, typically I go to, even as a classroom teacher building my own classroom library, I've always gone to YALSA, like the young adult part of the American Library Association. They're the ones that put out like the best books for young adult lists every year, the Prince Award, the Morris Award, like that's all from the American Library Association.
I'm
So
sorry.
if I
I'm sorry. What is that called? You'll what?
YALSA, YALSA, I forget what young adult library something association, but it's just ALA. It's the American Library Association. It's just like their young.
Okay. Okay.
And again, they're the ones who are putting out like if you've seen like the Prince Award, and the Morris Award is for best debut in a given year. The Margaret Edwards Award, like they have tons of awards that usually come out in January every year at the ALA Midwinter Conference.
Yeah, I
That's
know that.
usually go to that for my book collection as a classroom teacher or as a librarian. I have got full support. My administration,
That's
and that
good
is
because
dealing with a lot of like young adult books that have LGBT and dealing with race again in a really honest way. I don't get any pushback with that. It's when I've gone off the map a little bit, and I'm trying to find also some really popular books to have on the shelves to, again, just to get kids into reading. And
yeah.
I had a case of when I talk about books being too spicy and talking to some of my like high school students about it, I think we had a very different understanding of what spicy meant, because I never read like modern romance. So when I see like, tons of kids with a book called Icebreaker that just has this illustrated cover that looks totally innocent, and then some of them are telling me like, no, not like it is. These are books with very graphic sexual content. And these are huge bestsellers, but they're not young adult novels. So if I'm like going off into that category, that's where I have to be very, very careful, because I've got 14-year-olds in my building, and if they walk home with a book that they picked up and it's got very explicit sexual content, I don't have really any defense for that, other than like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what spicy meant when I was talking, like if I haven't read that myself. But if I stick to like the young adult world, then I'm good, because young adult just doesn't have that in it. Like by like definition, it doesn't have graphic sexual content. That's a different genre completely.
Is your school a public school or is it private?
Yeah. No, it's public school.
Okay, because I was just going to say, not to go off tangent, but speaking of like that, you have to be careful of the books that you choose for your students. Because I was certified to teach ERWC. Some, I don't want to single them out, but we did have part of our student population, their religious practice would not even allow them let alone touch the book nor read it.
Yeah.
So when it came to that, I was like, oh geez, how am I going to problem solve this? Because our school, it's an optional school. So you can either take the classes or you can do them in packets if you want to progress faster. But they always try to steer the kids towards the classrooms, because the packets they're supposed to be turning in a packet a month, especially for the hardcore classes like English, math, and science. But I remembered that two of my kids were of this religious group, and they had a huge issue with that. So I said, okay, this is not going to happen again. I know that there are some students that do come from private religious schools, and suddenly they're in the public school. Their parents get a little bit of we got some feedback that they cannot touch these books. And, when it comes to public education, these books are in the public system. They're not banned or anything. So I said, okay, how am I going to problem solve this? So what I did was that I wrote out the modules for both my juniors and seniors. And I let them know, I said, I'm going to have you guys take about 10 minutes to work on this. There are 3 novel studies that you guys have a choice to choose from. There's 2 plays and 1 novel. One of these plays is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And that was the book that these students from that religious background could not read, let alone touch. So I said, if I get I'm going to let them know. I said, this is what the book discusses. And there's some vocabulary in there that may or may not agree with you. I said, be brutally honest, put a yay or nay next to that module. And if I come back, when I get your papers back with any nays, then we're not going to do it. And that way we're all on the same page. Have you found that you had to do that for some of your students? If there was a book that they like, especially for the juniors, AP, and honors, did you ever get that kind of pushback?
I have not personally. I'm not sure if any of my colleagues have. I'm sure they have, like from specific parents at specific times, but I personally haven't had to deal with that at all yet. Again, 20 years into my career. But again, I think a lot of it is just because of the model of my classroom, like focusing so much more on just reading workshop and having kids choose the vast majority of the year. That kind of alleviates that problem. When you've got student choice, it's as simple as like, oh yeah, I would love to help your child find another book. That's my favorite thing to do as a teacher, is help you find a book that you're going to love, that that you as a parent are okay with, because I respect that too as a parent. But again, it's just a different model. It is when you get to assigning whole classes, where that can be more of a challenge, because now you're telling, everybody has to read this one book, and you're gonna find somebody. That's why Speak shows up on the banned book list so often as well.
Which actually goes to the next question. Were there any books on the challenge book list that you already read? I know Speak was one of them, but I think you mentioned one more.
Oh, I went through it, and there's a ton of them on here I've read over the years, and some of them are some of my all-time favorite books. Even the picture book, And Tango Makes Three, that one cracks me up that it's on there.
Yeah.
Stamped, I've read. There were lots of them on here. The Truth About Alice, I have read.
The Truth About what?
The Truth About Alice.
Oh yeah. Wait, was that
Jennifer Teo.
The Truth About Alice? No, that wasn't the one I read. I read I don't think it was The Truth About Alice. I think it was called Go Ask Alex.
Oh yeah, that was a huge one. Like back, I don't even remember when that one came out, but that was back in probably the 70s when that one came out. I know which one you're talking about, because they've turned that into a high school plays. But yeah, Speak definitely is on the list here. Dear Martin by Nick Stone. That's been a New York Times bestseller. That one actually came out the same time as my first book, Short History of the Girl Next Door. And Nick and I got to do some events together before the books came out, these like pre-publication book tours. So I got to spend a lot of time with Nick, which was super cool. But yeah, Dear Martin is a huge one that I've had a lot of students read. The 57 Bus is on here by Dashka Slater. I talked about that one. Sold by Patricia McCormick is a huge one that I make sure I get kids to read every single year. That I know I've
Sold or Sold?
Sold. That's about Patricia McCormick. It's fiction, but she was also an investigative journalist. And she it's about the sex slave trade in this case, India. And it's a young girl, Lakshmi, who's 13, who gets sold into prostitution unknowingly. But she did a lot of research on to get the details of this book right. But that's actually one that we use in the graduate course I teach as well, because it's just a stunning, beautiful book. So yeah, read that one. Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany Jackson is brilliant book. If you're really into like psychological thriller, Tiffany Jackson's amazing. That one's much more modern. Yeah,
that's the type of genre that I'm not really into.
Yeah, that's not my favorite either, but I definitely have lots of students that love it. But I did read that one, and it is really good. More Happy Than Not by Adam Silvera. Ellen Hopkins I've read. Perks of Being a Wallflower. All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiley. It's just, all of their books are brilliant. Jason Reynolds is, probably the biggest, most important name in young adult lit today. So all of his books are incredible. Let's see, there's a handful of graphic novels in a row here that I've read.
Would one of them be Fun Home by any chance?
I didn't read Fun Home, but Flamer I have read, and that's awesome. Drama by Raina Telgemeier is amazing. Kids absolutely love that one. That one just gets banned because it has gay characters who kiss, and it's at a middle school level, and that set off a lot of alarms for certain people. This One Summer was another awesome graphic novel that won awards that I've read. Looking for Alaska, John Green's one of my writing heroes.
Yes.
So Brandon the Kite Runner I've read.
That one I still have yet to read, but yeah, Kite Runner.
Frank, 13 Reasons Why. That was huge a bunch of years ago. Me and Earl and the Dying Girl is another hugely important book for me by Jesse Andrews. It is maybe the funniest book I have ever read in my life, but also deals with some really heavy issues. So that one's brilliant. And then same with The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie is another one in like the pantheon of books for me that have been really important to me as a writer and a reader and a human. The Hate You Give is brilliant by Angie Thomas. All her stuff's amazing. Yeah, like everything on this list is incredible, and I would want all kids to read all of these throughout their lives. And yeah, that's going to make certain people really upset. And,
Yeah.
you know.
And we basically say, and
yeah.
everyone's
So don't read it.
different.
If you don't want to read it, don't read it. If you don't want your kid to read it, okay, don't.
Yeah.
You just
So
don't
speaking of the ones that you read already, was there ever a story or narrative that was a challenge for you to get through because of the content or subject matter?
I was trying to think of that one. I can't think of any like that. There was one.
I mean, even one that was, I mean, did you ever feel that a story was so disturbing that you found it hard to really process?
There's one, I've had a lot of students really liked it, and it was one called Living Dead Girl. I think Elizabeth Scott was the author. That was just, it's real short, but it is, again, kind of like true crime type of story where the girl is just abducted in the very beginning and just held captive, and terrible, terrible things are done to her. But it's from her point of view. And that one was hard to get through. But other than that, no, I can't think of any that I've just like struggled to get through.
Right. So in your entire collection, what is the question here? What book could you not live without, and why? And does that book hold special meaning?
There was a couple here because like Part-Time Indian would probably be on there. But I think, again, if I have to choose one, it's still going to be Everybody Sees the Ants by A.S. King. I just think it is an absolutely perfect book. I love A.S. King anyway, all of her stuff. That one, for some reason, there's a whole bunch of little things that just really clicked with me personally when I read it. I love Lucky, the main character in that one. A.S. King, if you've never read her, she's weird, and she loves that her books are weird, and her readers love it as well. But she does a lot of like surrealism in her books, and books have different levels of it. So most of them have like a little tiny bit where there's just some little element where you're not sure if like this main character is about to have a psychological break or if this is really happening. And then she's got a couple other books that are just like full on surrealism, like the whole way through, like I Crawl Through It, I think, was one that is just nonstop surrealism. But in Everybody Sees the Ants, Lucky, our main character, is dealing with some pretty intense bullying to the point of like physical abuse from one high school guy who he's dealt with since the time he was a little kid. And when that goes too far, mom decides that nobody's doing anything about this. Dad's not doing anything about this. We are taking off for the summer and living with mom's brother in Arizona. So it starts in Pennsylvania. The biggest chunk of the book then is him in Arizona. I love it because it's like figuring out what it means to be a man in this world. And I know, like, I'm always not sure if I'm supposed to say that, but I think that's so hugely important for the young men that I've had in school my whole career, to know what it means to be a man, to like know where you fit and how you treat people and how you see yourself, and knowing like just what your role is as like, I don't know. Because it's really no different than just being how to be a good human being. But just having that male character deal with those questions, I think, was so important. And then there's so many little things I just love in that. The surrealism aspect is his grandfather was a POW in Vietnam. He never came home from Vietnam. And his always convinced that he's still out there alive in a prison camp in Cambodia somewhere. So in Lucky's dreams at nights, he's visiting his grandfather in like the jungles, actually of Laos, not in Cambodia, but he's like visiting his uncle or his grandfather in the jungle, and every time he wakes up, there's always like something from the jungle in his bed. So there's like, okay, is Lucky losing it here? Is this happening in the story? So it's just
Yeah.
that little surrealism element. It's
So
just
I don't want to call it a pun, but is the title "Everybody Sees the Ants, Everybody Sees the Details"? Would that be like another?
that's actually like another little surrealist detail in the book. There's these ants that show up, like when the bully is like pressing his face against like the hot pavement at the community pool over the summer and just like scraping along the cement. He's like seeing the ants on the sidewalk and they're kind of talking to him. And so the ants keep showing up throughout the book as well, just kind of almost like this Greek chorus, like of what's going on, have their own little personality that's just bizarre. But there's a line in there to where like later in the book about like maybe everybody sees the ants, and that's like where the title comes from.
I've never read it, but is it sort of like a, a monster calls? Is that kind
Mhm.
of like how?
I know the book you're talking about, the Patrick Ness, and I have not read that one, so I am not totally sure.
Okay, because that kind of is almost like like a surreal thing. Like this monster is preparing the young child to prepare him for this preparing him for the end with the life of his mother.
Yeah,
And he's sort of like the guide to mentoring him, even though I think the boy is also being bullied because he's different, he doesn't have any friends, and
yeah.
so on and so forth. As a teacher, as an adjunct teacher, are there any organizations, charities, or special events that are taking place that our viewers should know about presently that you would want us to like investigate or to participate in or to like look into?
I would think it's most important to find the ones in your own community that can have the biggest impact on your little part of the world. I know for me here, and I live in Hanover, Pennsylvania, just a small town in South Central PA, and just the YWCA, where in the town I live, does amazing work in all different areas that I love to support them in a bunch of different ways. And beyond that, just find your local independent bookstore and connect with them and support them. And I know we have a new one that's recently opened in my town called Little Fox Books that is just awesome so far. It's they're trying really hard to have events going all the time, especially for teenagers to have like this safe space to hang out. And so it's just awesome. And it's always important to support your local independent bookstore. So those
Okay.
are like the two biggest for me, but mostly figure out like in your own community, who are the ones doing the good thing in your world.
So before we get to the book, I just had a couple of other questions for you because you're talking about that your books cater to more young adult. For this particular book, Donuts and Other Proclamations of Love, at first, I the title kind of gave me the impression that these were going to be like compilations of stories. And
Yeah.
then when I found out, oh no, it's one big novel about Oscar Olson and what he goes through in his, I think it's his senior year in high school. When did you decide? I mean, I guess because of your experience as a teacher, you cater more towards young adult audiences. But did you ever think about a particular target audience um, as a writer that you would like to cater to?
Yeah. When I first, well, Donuts is the second book. The first book was called A Short History of the Girl Next Door. And when I was writing that one, when I first decided to like actually see if I could just finish actually writing a novel,
Yeah.
whether it got or not, because I like do it in my classroom a lot and I'm sharing my writing with my students. Um, I always kind of pictured so much of my career has been trying to again hit a lot of like my reluctant guy readers um
Mhm.
just as a teacher, so that's what I always kind of been pictured my audience being. I don't think it's ended up that way.
Mhm.
In fact, I thought short history was going to be just like a dude book. I thought that was going to be a book like catered to reluctant guy readers, and it just was not at all. It was not marketed that way. But really just young adult is just what I've always loved. It's what I fell in love with alongside my students years ago. It's what we were reading together in my classroom every single day. So that's just always kind of been what I've wanted to do. I like contemporary, realistic young adult fiction, of just very honest characters with strong voices. I love books where the character knows what they love and just works their ass off to get what they want, whether that's basketball or baking, or
Yeah.
I just love reading characters who just throw everything they have at this thing that they love. Because I like
Yeah.
just as a human, I like that whole creative process and that just like working towards things that you're passionate about. So I love characters who do that. So I think that's probably like what I go for. I think I'm a pretty selfish writer. I'm typically
Oh,
just things that make me happy.
yeah.
And it makes me happy to talk to my students about like trick or treat traditions and Thanksgiving traditions and goofy stuff that happens in the classroom. And so that's a lot of scenes like that show up in my own writing.
So as a teacher and a writer, a
Mhm.
lot of this question often comes up for most, and every writer is different. Do you have a particular process of how you start a project, outline it out, and then by the time it gets to the finished product, what does the writing process look like for you during a typical day?
I don't have a very strong like daily writing routine. Again, just being a teacher, I struggle to get a whole lot done during the school year.
Mm,
So most of my heaviest writing happens in the summer when I'm not teaching. That's when I like get the most finished in manuscripts, because that's when I'm a very slow writer as well. It takes me a while. I'm just spacing out a lot, and it takes a while to get going. So having little chunks of time. I know there's people who can compartmentalize and like I'm going to write a half hour at
yes,
4:30 in the morning every day. Like
that's the
I
word.
can waste a half hour in no time at all, just spacing out. Like half hour does nothing for me. So I need those long stretches of time, like in the summer, where I can just, that's all I'm thinking about. During the school year, that's not possible for me. Um, I'm still able to like keep my brain in whatever book I'm working on, because I use my writing in my classroom. I'm always writing in front of my students. So that always
Right.
over. My actual process of like getting a book from start to finish, though, is 100% taken from like the writing workshop model that I've done with my students when like eighth graders, when I started from my very beginning of teaching, from Nancy Atwell, because again, they were just studying what authors do. So the things that I was like, the lessons that I was getting from Nancy Atwell, again, my one rule in my classroom for myself is I will never ask my students to do something I'm not willing to do too.
Mm,
So any writing assignment I give, I'm also doing it. So that meant from the very beginning, again, like I said, if I'm asking them to write memoir, then I was going through that process too, and I was using Nancy Atwell and the writing workshop model of like, starting with some of these brainstorming activities to get some
yeah.
memory, and then drafting lessons like I was doing them too. And for novel writing, like it was started with the fiction unit within Nancy Atwell's writing workshop. So it would start with a main character questionnaire, which is I share with my students every year because it's the most useful tool I have as a writer. And you can find them online. I didn't invent it. There's tons of versions of these.
That just reminded me of something. I did something similar like that. It's called the hero or heroine's dossier. Do you kind
Mhm.
of have them start off with that when it comes to creating a main character?
Yeah, basically, it was just we kind of start like real simple. If I'm doing like a fiction unit with my students, we start just again brainstorming like some potential problems that they might want to explore first. They don't have to
Mhm.
settle on them, but just to have some ideas of things I might want to tackle, thinking about like the books that they've read, what those authors are tackling, whether it's like bullying or drug abuse or just relationship stuff or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, what do you want to tackle? And then we start this character questionnaire, which again, the version I use is like 15 questions. And the idea is for me to like write it as though you were talking to your character. Like you're pretending your character is sitting across from you. You ask the question and you just like record exactly what they say in their voice. And the more you make them ramble and talk, the
Yeah.
more know, the more you're going to use it. So I usually have, when I do this myself, I've done it for every book I've written now. I usually have like 20, 30 handwritten pages of my character just rambling, answering these questions before I ever even start chapter one. But a lot of that stuff will show up in the book. I'll be able to take whole passages of that and plop it into like early chapters when you're, establishing who this character is and going into little flashbacks and that kind of stuff.
God, that reminds me of what Ray Bradbury was discussing in I'm not sure if you saw this series called The Big Read.
Mm-mm.
If you go on YouTube, you can see it. But he talks about how his characters from Fahrenheit 451, which, if I'm not mistaken, is now a challenge book. But I think that's like my core book right there. Yeah. I taught that book for so many years. And it's weird how every time I read it, I'm still finding something new that I don't recall reading about.
Yeah.
But what he was talking about is that the characters, he asked, like, who's the villain here? Captain Beatty. He asked, what made you? Why did you burn books and all that? Yeah. So the characters would come to him, very much like what you're.
Yep.
Very much like you were discussing. What I do is that I'll take certain passages or quotes and I write them down in journals. I think I have like 30 or 50 of them. So speaking of donuts and other proclamations of love, what was the spark?
So for this one, there was a couple of things. Again, just as a selfish writer, at the time I was really like fascinated with food trucks and I wanted to just try that because it was fun. And I like just exploring that. And again, I like having these characters who just work their butt off towards this thing that they love. So that was one that just like, that seemed really interesting and fun to do, to have this character who would work on a food truck and just try and be like, do this as a living and just wanting to cook and create all the time. So it started with that combined with, my brother-in-law, so my wife's younger sister, is married to a guy from Åland, which is in this island between Sweden and Finland, right, which is where Oscar is from and where Farfar is from. So Andre, my brother-in-law, like they all live here in Hanover now, but he grew up in Åland and for most of his life lived there. And so a lot of that, like I just took from him. His oldest son now is like early middle school, but when he was just a little guy, we would babysit him a lot when Andre would get to our house after his work to pick up Lincoln. He would always come in and just say like, hey, Guben, which Guben is just like Swedish for old man, but this term, like you call it, you're like big guy. And I just always loved that. So I stole that and incorporated those elements into the book. So now Oscar is from Åland and Farfar is just Swedish for your dad's dad. It's a little more structured in Swedish where you don't have like 8,000 different names for grandparents.
Right. Farfar, so and as I'm going through, there were a couple of terms that maybe I just want to get your feedback on. Far
Yeah.
more.
Far more is like your dad's mom. So far is dad's dad. Farmar is dad's mom. Marmar is your mom's mom, and Marfar is your mom's dad.
Wow. Okay. So because far more, and then there was another one I forgot. So I was trying to figure out. Okay, wait a second. Far is the grandfather. So Farmer would be like, I guess,
Would
Oscar's
have been like,
grandmother.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And there was not sure if you noticed this, but in this particular published version I had, I was reading it and I just found that it was published with one typo. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't know.
Yeah, so it was on page 8. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure which publication this was, because I'm pretty sure that there are like there's hardcover publication and then there's paperbacks.
I've got it here.
Yeah, it's on page 8. Farfar would have frowned and asked me about inappropriate language. There's a T instead of an A. Just out of curiosity. I'm not sure if you noticed that. That was just the one that I just found there. So
Oh yeah, I never even. Oh no. I wasn't asked. That was my version of like to be tisked, like tisk.
oh, okay. Okay, I'm so sorry.
I was good. Like,
Okay.
oh really? I've read this like a billion times. I hope there's not a whole bunch of typos. Good. No, that one's
Okay,
that one.
I just wanted your
That one's
feedback on
good.
that one. Okay. But it's interesting, as I was reading the novel, as I was reading the story, very much like Oscar, where it said, there's a couple of times when he mentions it, that Lou had all the patience in the world to listen to Farfar's stories, and he never even considered to ask. It's interesting how there's a parallel between not only Oscar starting to really delve and listen into Farfar's stories as the story goes on, but we're, as readers, we're learning with him.
Yeah.
It's almost like all these memories of Farfar and who Amir really was until the end, we don't know anything about it. So it's interesting. Is that kind of like how you wanted the story to go? Where we are learning along with the main character. We don't have a clue as to his past history.
Yeah, it gave me away. One, that just gave me away as a writer to weave in so much of Farfar's story, because that was such a central part of it, is his backstory.
Mm-hmm.
So it gave me a way to include that like Lou wants to hear these stories. And it was also a way just to show Oscar is so sometimes caught up in his own insecurities about not being a student, with the struggles with reading, just hating school, and that fear that he has that like even the people he loves are kind of judging him for it, that secretly Oscar would want him to go off to college. And like any mention of that, he's just immediately
Taking it back,
paralyzed by it, hurt by it, and just gets so caught up in that he's just like not seeing like the bigger picture, which is, I think, something that we all do in different ways.
Yeah, but it's interesting how like I feel there's, when it comes to certain stories that I read, I feel like there's some quotes that need to be written out, laminated, and used as a type of visual aid for students to really like think about. There's a few of them, like where it says here, I was too young to understand that it was Farmer's turn to claim a new life, that sometimes there's a limit to how long a person can live in the aftermath of things beyond her control. So I'm just questioning for myself. I've had classmates and students that were raised by their grandparents other than their parents. Have you had students over the years that have come to you with the relative other than being their own parent?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I think if you work in public education anywhere, you're going to come across, kids have all kinds of trauma or just different reasons for who they're living with. And yeah, absolutely.
Does that also change how you teach them compared to ones that have their parents with the students? Or
I think
is it kind of around the same thing?
I think it's just made me think about more over the years doing certain like brainstorming activities where, you might just ask. I think like the stereotype when you think of is like asking a little kid to draw their family and assuming that it's a mom and a dad and blah, blah, blah. And like it comes back. doesn't want to do that. But those kinds of things over the years of like asking kids if we're doing memoir brainstorming activities of like, what's like a favorite moment with like a parent, and you might have kids who don't have that. So I even have the point now where if I'm even doing memoir as a genre, I throw it out there like, listen, not everybody likes writing about their own lives for any reason. So if you would rather do this from like a fictional point of view, like it's the same writing skills either way. It's still narrative writing skills. So I try and be more careful and cognizant of that now, because I never want to be the one causing any of that kind of hurt inadvertently in my classroom and like maybe losing that little bit of connection with the kid. So it's just made me think about it more and like being careful about like the things that I wouldn't think of that are just like, hey, tell this funny story or share this memory that, I just do it like really quickly, not thinking about it. Like maybe that was just a jab at somebody that I didn't know was causing a little bit.
Then we come to chapter 3, which is my personal favorite chapter right here. The paper bags hold more than groceries.
Yeah.
Have you ever done this with your students, where you had them take out the paper bag? Just curious. And how did that like?
One of my colleagues does it, a bag speech, but I didn't know that colleague when I wrote this. I wasn't up at the high school yet, so when I wrote this, it was just more like having like a teacher friend who taught in a different school talking about like that speech course you take in high school. That's like a very typical first speech assignment in like a speech class is the paper bag speech. So I just kind of ran with that, knowing like, yeah, probably they would.
It's brilliant. I think this is, I mean, I've had students even in the high school level where they're so full of social anxiety that they can't even get a word out. So I think what they're talking about, the paper bag speech, is having that prop to show everyone, here, look, this is what it is here. Then that goes into the thing all about, I love that you added these two, because right now with who talking about taking away the DEI in just about everything, talking about Jorge and Jesus. And I loved this. This is, to me, this was genius. Immigration. I'm sorry, what is it? Immigrant generational sacrifice. Spot on. I am so glad that you mentioned that. But it's interesting how Jorge takes out the 3 individual pieces. I mean, if you were, just out of curiosity, if you were to have this, if you were a student still, and you were to pull out something from a paper bag, what would be the 3 things that you would take out? Just out of curiosity.
For me personally, it would probably be, if I had to do it now, I don't know what I would have done as a student. As a student in high school, I would have tried to play it pretty safe and done something about basketball and maybe something about like drawing and cartooning. Probably at the time I was convinced I was going to be an architect, so it'd probably be something connected to Frank Lloyd Wright or architecture. It would have been much less forthcoming than I think what I had my characters do. It'd be a good writing activity actually though too, to like just for your main characters, like what would their paperback be, which was ended up helping me figure out a lot of these, because that's one of the early scenes and that was one of the I wrote, and it really helped me figure out who some of these characters were, like who, like this other side of Lou as well. Off the bat helped me figure out like, oh, okay, she's got way more going on here.
Yeah, which we'll get to that in just a moment. But I just found that there were a few I guess I like to call them power. I call them power points in the novel. So immigration and immigrant generational sacrifice is one of them. Drug abuse is one of them. Entrepreneurship and what it takes to do that. And also the senior year. This is the final year before. And it's just interesting how, as he's learning about his history, that we learn with him, and we're actually going through all of those steps with him. Yeah, and we talked about the one about the audiobooks being used as alternatives, which I think that needs to be instilled in public education. I think even private education too.
Mhm.
I love how you said Mrs. Bixler's big on floundering. She says you only really learn by screwing up, and there's an awful lot of that in the kitchen. And that reminds me of one of my modules that says, if you want to get into college, learn to fail.
Mhm. Yep.
So
Very.
that was brilliant. This was interesting about Lou's project, which I think seemed to be, I don't want to call it I can't really call it a deception, but I want to say maybe it was like something that kept her busy as a student while she waited for the colleges to get back with her, on top of which we don't know the secret of her brother's drug abuse problem. But when it came to learning about food waste, what brought that on, and what made you think that that needed to be part of the story?
I think that was just figuring out like how do I get these two together.
Hmm.
And I knew I have Oscar working on the food truck. He's passionate about cooking and baking. He's got all these independent studies in his day, his senior year. How do I get Lou in his life on a daily basis that's going to drive him nuts? And I made her, she's very much like students that I've had over the year. Like you have those, super type A, super driven students who are involved in
Yes.
absolutely everything. Both my daughters have been Girl Scouts, so I decided like, yeah, we can make this her Girl Scout, like her gold service award that
Mm.
requires a billion hours. And doing the food waste thing was like, that was just my creative solution to like forcing them together. Like, all right, it's got to be food related. How do I get them together? Like, okay, hers is going to be, and that's something like just being a teacher on cafeteria duty for a
Right.
long time. You see how much like things just are not eaten on a food tray and just get like chucked whole
Yes.
every day. And
And
there was,
I was going to ask you, did you actually consult scientists, like when she's talking about when it comes to the 2000 apples, did you know that food waste like these apples releases methane? As an
yeah,
English teacher, I mean, who did you consult for that
I
kind
went to the
of
Google machine for that. That's just some of the really light research that you do as a writer, like trying like, okay, I got to get these details right. But that was nothing more than like a quick Googling of, byproducts of
right?
food waste. I
And then
thought
what? Yeah.
releases, but I didn't know how much. So that was just some simple Googling and researching.
Okay. And then what about the food truck? Did you consult anyone in particular for that one either? Or
Same deal. I remember early on when I was still at the very beginning phases of the book, I was like Googling like food truck floor plans. Like if you were going to go buy your own and modify it I was trying to get like the details right of like the two of them in this small kitchen type space. So I needed to have it like I had it drawn out in one of my first notebooks for it. Like, all right, what is the inside? What's the floor plan of the inside of their food truck? So I knew like, here's where the fryers are. Here's where like the refrigeration part is. Here's, the cooktop, like the griddle. So I would do just that kind of research. And beyond that, not really. I was just winging it on that part, hoping it sounded right.
to me, it sounded very, very accurate, because not too long ago there was a story of this family somewhere in Europe. Uh, the baby girl was the only one that was left alive. Apparently, I guess because I've seen people that like live off grid, and apparently this family was growing potatoes and they
Mm-hmm.
stored them. But the story goes, and this was when I read this, I was like, oh geez, there's that story just hit me again. All the members of the family went into the basement and they never came out. And that's because the whatever gas that was, probably methane or whatever, that is released from rotting potatoes
Ooh.
that are left there for too long. You're down there for a minute or two and you're gone. And that's what happened to the family. So reading this was like, oh geez, that just kind of reminded me of
Yeah.
that. Oh, there was something I loved how you talked about when it came to Farfar's background. When Lou asks him what made you come here, and how Oscar sees here as home with just him and Farfar. It's just their little world. But when he says it, he says, just following my dreams. He said his head down, his head down now, his voice quiet. And then Oscar saw that. It's like, it broke my heart a little watching it. No one should be hiding that much shame and guilt on their faces when the answer is following my dreams. And when we
Yeah.
learn later that he uprooted himself from his family, but we didn't know why.
Yeah.
And have you, when you did, when you were thinking about Farfar, did you have a relative in your life that uprooted from where they were to come here, where you are right now?
Not like that. I had a colleague years ago in like my earlier years of teaching, that she taught for a long time. She was like near retirement when I started teaching. And I remember like her kids were like in school at the same time I was. So like students together, and just knowing the story at the time of the dad at some point coming out as gay, and them like separating. And that one, it's just always kind of been in my head of like how hard that would have to be for everyone involved. That was like the Farmore line that you mentioned earlier, was very much that same thought of like, it's like it's not anybody's fault, but there's so much pain and shame and guilt,
Yes.
like blowing up your family and what happens from there, and figuring that out so late. Probably not necessarily I don't know, but figuring it out that late in life, or getting to the point where like you just have to tell the truth that late in life after you already have a family. It's always just been one like, I couldn't imagine having to go through that. And that's kind of what like wanted to do with Farfar, have a character that you clearly love, that is like a good man and is everything in Oscar's world, and is like raised him, but has this in his own background, this guilt that he is never going to shake. He's never just going to like have it disappear. He's always going to live with, and have that play into his character so much. So never like personally, but just, have seen it, once or twice, of just in my, tangentially in my life, and wondering about it.
And then he goes on to the Farfar School of Business for Oscar, when he teaches them about, it's not just a fantasy, this is an investment. But the fact that he was a civil engineer kind of helped him out a little bit. And he learned a bit from, what's the name of that university? Uppsala. And then because, Oscar, like you said, he's very, I want to say that he's kind of selfish in his own endeavors, but it's like, this is a passion that he's all about this. But Oscar tells him, I'm sorry, not Oscar, Farfar, Eric, tells him that finishing school is non-negotiable. Was that something that was instilled in you when you were growing up? That instead of going after,
I think, because that's just in reference to high school. I think that was never even a question. I'm like, have a privileged enough background. Like, there was never even a question of going to college. Like, my parents were going to, both my parents were teachers. We were, white middle-class family. We were like, it was, I'm sure had any of me or my brothers like decided we didn't want to go to school, I'm sure we would have been supported, but it was just kind of like also just assumed that like, yeah, you have this opportunity for this life. So personally, I never had that that like, you must finish this. I just wanted that to be realistic for Farfar, like at the very minimum, like, you are not dropping out of high school. You must at least finish this.
Yeah. And that fact that when he starts to teach, when Oscar, like you said, he was like, any kind of going off to college just bugged it out of him so much. But then he says, okay, if you want to know, I'll teach you. We'll take it one little step at a time. So he learns how to change the tire, and then he learns how to clean the fryer and all that. And I loved how you put this as doing taxes as sexy math. I don't know if that could be the spiciness of this novel that we were talking
that's it. That's all the spice I got in this thing. Yeah.
And then the one about Narcan, and I actually did some research on this. When did you decide that was going to be part of Lou's character?
honestly, I kind of forget when that started to kind of come into more focus as I was developing Lou as a character. Because initially, at the very beginning, it was just knowing, kind of dealing with this like just that romance trope of like the hate to love
Yeah.
trope. I wanted to mess with that, but just knowing that I would need to have her fleshed out more, that she needs more of a backstory. I don't honestly remember when it came to me of just like having the brother who was struggling, and probably it was when I was writing that paper bag speech scene early on, and just having that be part of her, and it gave me something to develop with her as the story progressed, that it's not just like this perfect world for her and she just gets to be this driven student, that like maybe
Right.
there's some stuff behind that.
And it's interesting how, and this is kind of made me think about how school administrations treat, like if there's siblings that want to go to the same institution, but because of what one did, which her brother fell into the into the fraternity, and
Yeah, yeah,
that he dropped out, and that she also decided to go for it because she's not anything like him. Especially now with all the protests and everything with the colleges, just everywhere in the US. Do you think that colleges have that some of them may have a double standard for like students, like siblings, I guess when it comes to siblings, and it's like their sibling went there but they failed, so they're not going to bother going on to chance another one. Do you think that that's been like a possibility, that some may have that double standard when it comes to that administration?
that's a good question. I don't know at like the college level, because the magnitude is so much bigger of just like how many students they get, and at a place like a UPenn or an Ivy League school, that they're getting tens of thousands of applicants every year, and
Mhm.
you would that you'd almost need, like, you don't know who your admissions counselor is going to be from year to year to year. So I don't know. That's a really good question. I am not sure if admissions counselors have that kind of data of like siblings who have not been successful or whatever, and if that could play into um, the admissions process. That's a good question that I do not know the answer to.
Yeah, I just found it interesting that when Oscar finally learns about why he overheard something that was not directed at him, but he took it a whole new
Yeah,
way, and it's like, oh boy, what's going on here? And then
yeah,
when I guess his friends are there together, that's when he learns, oh, that's her brother that she was referring to. But I
yep,
love this one here where you're talking about that it was the final game, and that Jorge and Jesus had, I guess, won it for the team or something. But it says here, accomplished was, let's see, it was surreal to just, there's that word surrealism. It was surreal to be just a few minutes on the other side of it. That story was over, and it was like we still had our hands on the back cover of the book. It's like, this is like when it comes to seniors, it's the end of that chapter.
yeah.
Do you kind of, as a teacher for juniors, I'm not sure if you ever taught seniors, but when you're talking to juniors, are you making them aware that, hey, the next year is going to be the final chapter of your regular schooling, and you're getting ready for a new chapter to be written out? How do you think students are prepared for that, or maybe they're not prepared
I think
enough?
it's just one of those things that you just have to live through. You just have to get to those certain milestones and be just on the other side of it, and just, again, that surreal feeling of like, oh, I guess I've just done that thing now. I guess like that was it. Now we're like moving on to a new part of life. But I don't know if it's, I could talk about it with my juniors, but until you actually live that, it's hard to really understand that feeling of it being over. I remember like in high school, again, like basketball was like my whole life in high school. That's all I wanted to do.
Mhm.
um, and I remember like one of my coaches talking about like how hard it'll be when your high school years are over, like when you're past that, and like not like you can't just go back and keep playing those years.
Yeah.
And heard him at the time like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then when you are finally past that, like, oh wow, yeah, that is a distinct painful feeling. um yeah, and that's just with basketball. So Yeah,
Yeah.
until you
Which,
actually,
but I kind of, but yeah, I see how the basketball thing played in the story because it's part of your
yep,
history,
yep.
which is cool. There were a couple of quotes. Kindness is hot.
Yeah.
And when the evil shows up, which it does far too often, heroes emerge. I feel like, again, we have, when it comes to classrooms, they have posters of particular quotes, usually from like Emerson or Roosevelt or Thoreau. In your classroom, do you have any particular quotes that you have students look at, or that you have them like?
Uh, Mine are not really character building as much because again, I'm just like always so reading, writing focused. I have like two quotes that I hit really hard throughout the year that are just reading and writing related. One is Stephen King quote I have up every single day. It's from his book On Writing. Um, he has the second half of that book. The first half is like his memoirs of how he became.
Yes, yes.
Second half is like his guide to anybody who wants to be a writer. And there's a line at the very beginning of that second half where he says, if you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. There's no way around these things that I'm aware of, no shortcut. So that's my day one every single school year, no matter what class I'm teaching. Like that's how I start everything, because that's kind of drives the whole reading writing workshop. And then I just keep that quote up. Like when we do reading time every day, that's just like the quote that I have on my PowerPoint slide every day for reading time.
I thought that you
Then,
were going to say, I thought you were going to have his rule about omit adverbs.
no, not that one. That one didn't hit quite as hard for the length of the school year. But the other quote is, and I thought it popped into my head when you mentioned like the paper bag speeches.
Yeah.
It's a quote by, I think it's attributed to James Joyce, but he says, "In the particular is contained the universal." And it's confusing, but all it really means is that like the more you zoom in on specific things and moments and objects, the more people connect. So it's a good one when you're teaching young people poetry, like how to write poetry,
Yeah.
and teenagers want to write these really vague, confusing things about these feelings of isolation that nobody wants to read, and because they can't understand what you're saying. It's like try and do the opposite. The more you zoom in on a very specific moment in time or an object, the more people will connect to that bigger feeling that you're trying to hit. That same idea with like the paper bag, like I can figure out so much about my characters by coming up with three objects, three very specific things that they would pull from that bag. So same concept of like in the particular is contain the universal. I can't write that whole line about generational sacrifice
Right.
without him pulling those objects from the bag. Like it wouldn't have hit as nearly as hard. It would have just been like character rambling. But
Yeah.
with the objects, like you can hit those bigger feelings. So that's the other big one I try and hit throughout the year.
You mentioned about, because I'm not sure if you saw my review, but
Mhm.
in that video, I said chapters 31 to the end of the book, I was bawling. Because I was not expecting that incident. And this is interesting that I wanted to ask you, because you said that you need to be aware of what you're pulling as the pretend librarian right now. You have to be aware of what you're pulling, maybe from, what did you say, like book talk, or the kind of
Yeah.
what I guess the reading material.
Yes, and mostly that was like age genre, because a lot of the biggest titles on Book Talk are in that category that we started calling new adult a couple years ago. I forget if that term has stuck now, but they're typically college age characters,
Right.
or young actual adults instead of high school young adults, like young legal adults.
Yeah, but I'm just curious, because I spoke with one of the authors I interviewed earlier was Avi. I'm not sure if
Mhm.
you've ever read his works.
Yeah, way back in uh, when I started teaching, his was he had books that were like in textbooks. They would have been like novels that came with the textbooks that you bought. Like he was a
Right.
huge.
He was telling me about one of his one of the books that he was thinking about writing, but he never ended up doing it because it would alienate uh his type of writing, but for others it would be most welcome. So with this chapter here, the incident in Smithsboro, where you
Yeah.
mentioned where Farfar, Oscar, and Lou are looking in the truck. I guess the name of the street, I forgot what's going on. It's a street that was
Mhm.
named after originally a Confederate
And
soldier or
that
something, was
told-
now
yeah,
being renamed Unity. And you
yeah.
mention some of these groups that are like the big hit ones: Sons of Confederate Veterans, the KKK, the Proud Boys, which were a huge impact on the Capitol coup d'etat. One of the students is Bryce, and
Mhm.
he comes from that kind of background. But when he took out, this Confederate flag from the bag, it was about the history. This is where I'm from, but that doesn't really reflect on who I am now, kind of. But did
Mhm.
you, by writing that, did it ever, like, were you ever afraid of going down that route of mentioning these groups, or is that something that needs to be discussed?
I think it needs to be discussed. When I wrote the book a bunch of years ago now. That scene was just I was so just haunted by um, the one huge news story, that scene of the man who just drove his car into the crowd, like after Charlottesville. And that was just
Yes. Oh my gosh,
memory
yes.
always, like, has just still just kind of haunts me, that whole idea. So I was very much using that as inspiration for that scene, for what happens there. So it was just very much of the time when I wrote that. And also
Mhm.
I teach in, again, where I it's South Central Pennsylvania. I'm in a pretty rural area, rural to suburban, but is also deeply conservative, very, very
I
red.
was That's what I was
Part
going to ask you, if that played a role in this.
Absolutely, it plays into it, and it's just something that I have to be aware of as a teacher. Like, I've had tons of students over the years, still do, who would have Confederate flags. um they can't have them in the parking lot anymore, but it's they're not even necessarily thinking of it as the hate symbol that it is. They're not all just
Right.
cognizant of that. It's just, this is how they were brought up, and it's hard to just like tell them, like, hey, your grandpa is a bad guy. And like, what are you talking about? Like, that causes like huge division. Like, it's something
Yeah.
I have to put my own political beliefs aside sometimes as a teacher, and
Mhm.
recognize that even though I don't agree politically with probably the vast majority of the families that I work with, like, they're still good people, and like
Yeah.
they love their kids, and they want their kids to like go to a great school, and they want to like be at their kids' sporting events, and you
Right.
know so it's something like, it can't just be like a us versus them dynamic. So I wanted to like pull that in a little bit with Bryce, that he's not just this obvious villain.
Gubbin
Just
ends up Gubbin ends up doing he goes in anyway because he's just a kid. He has yet to live his whole life ahead of him, and there's so much
yeah,
more to it.
yep.
And that how you ended it with, I'm not sure. And does this guy actually exist? It's mentioned after the graduation. It's the piece of paper that she gets. I can't think of the name of the author about
Oh, is it the
heaven.
poem? Yes,
Yeah.
that is actually my personal all-time favorite poem, by Shane Koycan. Is
Okay, Shane Koycan. I didn't
he's
know
a
if that was, yeah.
he's a Canadian spoken word poet. I was introduced to him by an eighth grade student a long time ago. He had a TED talk forever ago, that was, I guess, viral. It's had millions of views at this point, called "To This Day."
Mhm.
That we just watched it as a class, and it was just stunning, and just makes you think. And that was Shane Koycan one. So this is another one of his, Heaven or Whatever, that if you look it up, like,
That's right.
it is. I love the poem, and I love he almost made like a short film out of it as well. So it's like a
Really.
7 minute, like 6 or 7 minutes long, of just him reading the poem, but then there's like actors kind of doing like this on, like, again, just like a short film, that I
Mhm.
just love that has played a big part of it. I kind of forgot till you mention it now. That was also a big part of how I wrote the book initially, because in that poem, it's written like he's talking directly to his grandfather. Shane Koycan was raised by his grandparents. And the poem is written like he's talking directly to his grandfather and like heaven means to him. And I did that, like I had my students try it and I did it too. And that was like one of the early ways I figured this out, was like Oscar talking directly to Farfar. So in my original manuscript, the whole book is written that way, that he is talking to Farfar the entire time. You don't know what's happened to Farfar. You don't know what the full context is. Much later, but that he's just been there talking to him at his side from the beginning. And eventually, like my editor, we decided to change it to just more traditional narrative instead of like that you the whole time. But that helped me write it a lot. I loved that voice. I loved that narration style. So check out the poem if you've never watched it. I just love it.
Okay. And finally, last, what would be a message that you would want for future writers today to know? What would you advise them?
One is, again, just like that Stephen King quote, that you just read a lot, write a lot. There's no way around it. Like, you got to just spend the time doing it. Finding the books that you love, finding the authors that you wish you could be, that you could write like them, and try it. But I think even more so is that it's okay to fake it, that it's okay to just like have no idea what you're doing and just write anyway and pretend like you're an author already. So do the things that you think authors do. Join organizations like SCBWI if you're trying to write for children's and young adults, and find a critique group and go to little writing sessions and take classes and write about whatever the heck you want to write about that makes you happy. Because that's ultimately what's going to get you there in the end anyway. So just that fake it till you make it concept.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Mr. Reck, thank you so much for taking the time on this wonderful Sunday to talk to me. And I hope you guys enjoyed it too. And let me know of the next book that you're going to write. Let me know the next idea that you come.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. And you have a wonderful day. Say hi to everyone. And I hope to hear from you soon for the next book review. All right.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.